Okay. If you guys don't know me, my name is Alyssa. I'm one of the deacons here. I also am a life group leader. So, ladies, if you are not in a life group, come join me on Wednesdays. It's the place to be. My personal opinion, totally unbiased. It is the best life group. The others are really great too, but mine's personally my favorite. So, and none of the other life group leaders can argue with me right now. So, I have the mic. But we have a lot of fun in life group, and I've really enjoyed getting to lead it, and before that, getting to be a part of one. So I highly recommend. And there's childcare, so if you have kids, then you can just drop them off and not deal with them for an hour. But there's a couple things that I think you guys should know about me. Maybe you know them already, maybe you don't. But the first is that I have two favorite foods, coffee and ice cream. There is not a moment where you could say to me, Alyssa, do you want to get coffee? And I would say no. There's not a moment where you could say to me, do you want some ice cream, Alyssa? And I would say no. I will always want those things. But the other thing that you should know about me, and maybe you've already deduced this based on the stack here, is that I love books. I think that fiction is one of God's greatest gifts to us, and I think it is one of the ways that we reflect his character. Because God is a creator, and therefore he is creative. So anything that we do that is creative is a reflection of God's nature. So fiction especially is my favorite way to interact with the creativity that God has given to us. I've always loved reading from the time that I was a little kid. I used to spend lots of time just sitting in my room reading books. I used to be that I would get to the point where if I had 100 pages left of a book, I was finishing it that night. Like, if I had to stay up until 2 in the morning, I would do that because I just had to finish it. And 100 pages, that's really not that much, right? So I've got a few books here that have been really important to me, really influential to me and in my life. And I just want to read you guys a few quotes from them. So this first one is The Book Thief by Marcus Zusak. I think we've got a picture of that. Definitely did not take these photos on my dining room table last night. This is a book that I have read probably 6 times at least since I first read it about 10 years ago. It's a coming-of-age story. It's got a really fun narrator. It's narrated by Death, which I think is really interesting. He makes a point to say he's not the Grim Reaper. He doesn't carry a scythe. He only wears a robe when it's cold. But it gives a really interesting perspective. So I'm going to read you one of my favorite quotes from this book. Got to find my sticky note. And this is the book's description of itself, really. It says, it's just a small story, really, about, among other things, a girl, some words, an accordionist, some fanatical Germans, a Jewish fist fighter, and quite a lot of thievery. So, if you have not read this book, do you know what any of those things mean? None of those things sound particularly important, right? Like they're in a list in the beginning of the story, so they must be important to the story. But you have a handful of unnamed characters and a couple other things that have zero context. But as somebody who's read the book, I know that those things are important. And so reading this again, knowing the context for those things, that quote evokes a lot of emotion because I know what each of those things means and represents, and I know the role that they play. So I love that quote because it tells you everything that you need to know before you even have the context for it. Next, we have Voyage of the Dawn Treader by C.S. Lewis. This is part of the Narnia series. It is either book 5 or book 3, depending on whether you count it by publication order or chronological order. And I'm going to read you the quote my favorite quote from this whole book, because it was the first quote that I ever read that I thought, that's a good line. Okay, so this is the opening line of Voyage of the Dawn Treader. there was a boy called Eustace Clarence Scrubb, and he almost deserved it. That's a great opening, right? It tells you a lot about the character. It's funny, it's short, it's to the point, but it gets at the heart of this story because Eustace is one of your main characters. And whatever your opinion on the name Eustace, maybe you love it, maybe it has some great meaning. I don't know what it is, but I can say that it doesn't look particularly appealing. It doesn't sound that great to my ears. And so you can guess from that opening line that Eustace is probably not a super appealing person. He's probably not super fun to be around. But there's that key word, almost. He almost deserved it. He almost deserved this name. Which means that though Eustace may not be that appealing now, someday he will be. Someday he will rise past these characteristics that make him not enjoyable to be around. Okay. Next, we have a book that I read a little bit more recently. It's called Anxious People by Frederick Backman. I've read a few books by this author now. He's a Swedish author, and so his books are translated. And the person who translates them is absolutely brilliant. They do an excellent job. Got to find my sticky note here. And so this is at the end of the story. And it says, they say that a person's personality is the sum of their experiences. But that isn't true, at least not entirely, because if our past was all that defined us, we'd never be able to put up with ourselves. We need to be allowed to convince ourselves that we're more than the mistakes we made yesterday, that we are all of our next choices too, all of our tomorrows. And as you can see, this quote comes near the end of this story. And this is a book about, as the title might suggest, a bunch of very anxious people. And they all get locked in a room together. And the entire story takes place with all of these people, with all of their emotional baggage and their fears and the things that they've done and their worries and their hopes, all boiling around in this one tiny apartment. And they have all of this baggage, and then you have this quote at the end that says, we are more than that. We are more than just these things that we've done. We are more than just these fears. And I think that's a beautiful quote. I think it's a beautiful thing to hope for, that you can be more than what you were yesterday. And then the last one I have is from J.R.R. Tolkien's Fellowship of the Ring. This is a book that I read, again, somewhat recently, within the last couple years. And there's some context that goes with this one. We'll get into the context of the story a little bit later. But this is the book that taught me to be patient with books, this whole series, because it's not an easy read. But when I was a teenager, everything was an easy read. I was reading mostly young adult books, and I realize now that those are designed to make you read them faster. Like, they've got really large print, really big margins, so that you feel like you're reading really fast when actually there's just not that many words. And that's just not the case with Lord of the Rings. It's just not. And so I started it thinking that I was going to finish it in maybe a month. The whole series, I was going to finish it in maybe a month. Any guesses on how long it took me? It took me a full year. The girl who, for most of her life, read at least 3 books a week, took a full year to read this whole series. And it was worth it. It's a beautiful story. It's excellently told. And someday I'm going to read it again, and it's not going to take me a full year to read the whole story. But that's why this book is important to me. And there's a quote in it that I've come to really love. And I took my sticky note out, and I knew that I was going to have a problem with this. Give me just a minute. It's because the words are so tiny, guys. There we go. Okay. So If you're not familiar with Lord of the Rings, again, we'll get into more of the context a little bit later. All of these quotes are going to come back up as we go through this sermon. But this is one of my favorites. This is said by one of the major side characters to the main character, okay? He says, I am Aragorn, son of Arathorn, and if by life or death I can save you, I will. That's a strong statement. If by life or death I can save you, I will. I would sacrifice everything because you are worth it. And I would live my life in a way that benefits you, if that's what it takes, because you are worth it. Now, you might be noticing a theme with a lot of these books, that there is a deeper significance. All of these things hint that there is something more to the things that they describe, to the people that they describe. Eustace almost deserves his name because he will become more than what he is. We need to be allowed to believe that we are more than the choices we have made, that we can be our next choices too. In the book Thief in particular, that list is a bunch of things that don't mean anything. But I know that the accordionist that's unnamed in the first paragraph in that list, that's the main character's foster father, and he is the most important person to her. He is the first person to love the main character unconditionally, just seemingly without reason from the moment that she meets him. And that's what that means. It just says an accordionist in the beginning, but there's something so much deeper to that. So you might be thinking that this is a sermon about books. It's not. I promise you it's not. I've found a lot of value in books and stories, and for me, these stories in particular have helped me to understand truths about God. They've helped me to understand what he thinks about things. But ultimately, they can't tell me what God thinks about things. They can be helpful illustrations, helpful tools to understand these truths. But the Bible itself will always be the ultimate authority. It will always be the source to tell us what God thinks about things. And so if we are looking for something printed to tell us, the Bible is always going to be our source. And so we're going to be in the book of Philemon, which again, I moved my bookmark. I really thought I marked this, guys. I promise I usually have my act together. But we're going to be in the book of Philemon. It's a really short book, so if you're flipping in a physical Bible, you might miss it. It comes after Hebrews. No, it comes before Hebrews. It's only one chapter long, because the book of Philemon is a letter from one man to another on behalf of a mutual friend. And so you have the Apostle Paul. He's the one writing this letter. And he is appealing to Philemon on behalf of somebody who is deeply important to him, his friend Onisimus. He refers to him as his son. So Philemon is the leader of a church, and Onisimus is his servant, his slave, as this translation says. And Philemon has probably done something wrong. Not Philemon, Onisimus has probably done something wrong because he has run away from Philemon. And he likely ends up with Paul because he sought Paul out, knowing the influence that Paul had over Philemon and over the church that Philemon helped to lead. And so he probably sought Paul out. And while he was with Paul, who was in prison at the time, he becomes a Christian. Paul leads him to faith. He leads him to Jesus. And Onisimus becomes a believer, and he becomes a disciple underneath Paul. And so we're going to read a few verses from the middle of this, and we're going to start in verse 10. Okay? It says, I am appealing to you for my child Onisimus, whose father I have become during my imprisonment. Formerly he was useless to you, but now he is indeed useful both to me and to you. I'm sending him, that is my own heart, back to you. I wanted to keep him with me so that he might be of service to me in your place during my imprisonment for the gospel, but I preferred to do nothing without your consent, in order that your good deed might be voluntary and not something forced. Perhaps this is the reason he was separated from you for a while, so that you might have him back forever, no longer as a slave, but as more than a slave, as a brother, especially to me, but how much more to you, both in the flesh and in the Lord. And so we see a lot here that Paul has a lot of thoughts and he has a lot of observations about Onisimus. And if we're talking about the deeper significance, the deeper value of a thing and of a person, Paul is very aware of Onesimus's value, and he seems pretty aware of what Philemon thinks about Onesimus's value. And so I think something that's really important to note here is that what you think of a person is a reflection of how you perceive their value. What you think of a person is a reflection of how you perceive their value. And so in verse 11, we see Paul says, "Formerly he was useless to you." That's an indication of how Philemon views Onesimus. He was useless. He was a slave who didn't do what he was supposed to and then ran away. He was useless. And that means that Philemon thinks that Onesimus has no value. But there is a point here that I want to make, that there is a difference between perceived value and actual value. Because how you perceive somebody's value is not always reflective of the actual value of that thing or that person. For instance, these books. These are all deeply important to me, and they mean a lot to me, and they have a lot of value to me. But those of you who have not read them probably don't care that much about them. Some of these books I've had for years. Some of them I've gotten more recently because I wanted my own copy after they were borrowed from the library or from a friend. But each one of these individual books and individual stories is really important to me, but they may not be to you. And if we're being honest, probably neither of our perceptions about these books are actually accurate for what their actual value is. So, as we're talking about value and the value of people and the value of things, mostly people, let's understand that perceived value is not the same as actual value. Perceived value changes from person to person, from moment to moment, but the actual value does not change. It is not affected by you or anything, okay? Actual value does not change. And so to go back to Scripture, you have Philemon, who seems to not think that Onesimus is worth very much. But then you have Paul. Paul, who uses phrase to describe Onesimus like, my child. He says, my very own heart. I'm sending my own heart back to you. The thing that gives me life, the thing that is the center of my being, that's what Onesimus is to me. In essence, what he's saying is that Onesimus could not be any more valuable to me. He is the most valuable. And that's what he's conveying to Philemon. He's saying, I know how you perceive him, but this is what his value is. And we notice there's a difference here because Paul's perception is not based on what Philemon's position or what Onesimus's position to him is. It's not about what what Onesimus can do or has done for him. It's based on Onesimus himself. And it's based on knowing what Onesimus's true value is. So we tend to think about uselessness and value as being deeply connected. So to go back to that idea that formerly he was useless to you, we so often think that those are the same thing, that usefulness or uselessness is your value. If you are not useful, you do not have value. That's what we think, but that's not what Paul says. What we see in this is that usefulness is not the same as value. Rather, usefulness comes from knowing your value. Because when Onisimus came to Paul, he was a runaway slave. And in that society, he didn't have a lot of value. But when he comes to Paul and when he comes to know Jesus, when he becomes a believer, he knows what his actual value is. And that's the value that Paul holds for him. And it's only after he accepts that he becomes useful. Now, he is useful both to you and to me, Paul says. So we can see that usefulness is not the same as value. It is an overflow of knowing your value. That's when you are most useful. So to go back to our illustration from the Chronicles of Narnia, the character of Eustace, most of that book, he is pretty useless. He doesn't do anything but complain. He just whines. He gets transported from his house in the middle of nowhere to a magical world where there are dragons and sea serpents and magic, and he gets to go on an adventure with his cousins and with all of these great people. And he just complains all the time. He can't even see the beauty of the world that they're in. In his head, it's all just a storm. It's all chaos. And he does nothing but complain about it. And then he gets himself into a really sticky situation where he turns into a dragon. He tries to steal something from a dragon's hoard and ends up a dragon himself. And they don't know how to turn him back. They can't do anything about that. He certainly doesn't know how to do it. And he goes back to the ship, to these people that he's with, and they don't even recognize him. And they start trying to kill him because he's a dragon, and it seems like he's trying to attack them. And Lucy, his cousin, who is shown throughout all of the books to be a kind-hearted, good-natured, compassionate person, she sees him for who he is. She sees this dragon, she looks at it, and she says, "You're not Eustace, are you?" And Eustace, as a dragon, just sadly nods his head. He can't speak, he can't do anything. But Lucy recognizes him, and she says, "This is Eustace. We've been looking for him. He's been missing. And he's back. He's here. This is a good thing. We can't turn him back. We don't know how to do that, but he's here." And when Lucy recognizes Eustace for who he is, that's when Eustace starts to become useful. He starts to become part of the team. He starts to learn what it looks like to help people, to do something worthwhile. Not for what people can give him, not for what he might get in return, but truly to help them for their benefit. And that's the essence of the best kind of usefulness. To be useful and helpful for someone else's sake, not for what you can get out of it. There's also another part of Paul's appeal, going back to Philemon. It's not just, "Hey, this is Onisimus. I love him." He's saying, "You should see him how I see him." That's what he's really saying. See Onisimus as I see him. See the value in him, the true value, not just what he has done, but see him for who he really is. See him as I see him. And in this, you can see that acknowledging a person's value often means changing your perception of them. Because if you are basing your opinion of somebody's value, if you are basing what you think of somebody based on the things that they have done, and they've done wrong things to you, then how are you ever going to see them differently if you're unwilling to change that perception when you know their true value? This is something that I personally have had a problem with in the past. I'm getting better now by the grace of God. But I used to be a very absolute kind of person. And when I made up my mind about somebody, it would not change. When I was a teenager, there was a boy that I had a feud with for like 10 years because he annoyed me one time. He was pretty arrogant. It was more than one time, if we're being honest. He got on my nerves, I got on his nerves, and we just had a feud. We were as close to arch enemies as you could get at like 16. And even long after I was not around him, even long after we'd both gone to college and he'd gotten married and he'd gotten a job as a youth pastor, which, by all accounts, it seems like he's doing really well in life. Even after that, for a long time, I still said things like, yeah, I don't like him. He's still terrible. I had no evidence to back that up. And the Lord really changed my heart on that. And I haven't seen this guy in a long time. I don't know for sure that he's changed, but I like to believe that he has. He has a wife and a daughter, and he helps lead in a church. And I like to believe that he is not the person he was when he was 16 years old. That he is not the person that he was then. And I hope that the next time I get to interact with him, that I get the opportunity to treat him differently than I did before, because I was not kind to him. And I think that's really what that quote from Anxious People is getting at, this book about we are not the sum of our past mistakes or experiences. And we need to be allowed to believe that we can be more. Because when you are unwilling to change your perception of somebody, then you don't allow them to be anything more than what they were. They will always be what they have always been if you are unwilling to change your perception of them, if you are unwilling to allow them the space to be different. And here's what all of this really comes down to. The value of a person is not determined by what they've done, but by what Jesus says about them. It's not determined by what they've done. It's not determined by what you think their value is. It is determined by what Jesus says about them and what he's done for them. That is why I love that quote from Fellowship of the Ring so much. Because the context around that, I think in the movie it's a little bit different. I haven't seen the movies. But you have these 4 hobbits. And the hobbits are kind of like the least noticed, least cared about people in the entire world of Middle-earth, the entire world of Lord of the Rings. They kind of do their own thing off in the Shire. They don't interact with anybody else. Some people don't even really think that they exist. And you have these 4 hobbits who are tasked with the most important mission that Middle-earth has ever had: to destroy a magical artifact that belongs to the most evil being ever to exist. They have that job. And Aragorn, he's a king, or he will be. He's a soldier, he's a fighter, he is strong, he is powerful, he is capable, he is everything that the hobbits are absolutely not. And this quote, that if by my life or death I can save you, I will, Aragorn speaks that to the hobbits the night that he meets them. He doesn't know them. He doesn't know who they are. He's never met them before. But he knows that somebody has gone before him and said, watch out for them because they are worth more than you could ever know. And Aragorn takes that word to heart. And he vows that he will save them to the best of his ability, whatever it takes. He will protect them, he will save them, he will help them. Because somebody else said that they were valuable. And he spends the rest of this trilogy doing just that. Not just for the hobbits, but for everybody else too. Everybody that he encounters, he does his best to protect and care for and save. And can you just imagine for a minute saying something like that to somebody that you just met? Being so certain of their value. Believing so strongly that they are worth sacrificing for, that you would vow to do it the moment you met them. I have a hard time picturing it. There are certainly people that I love deeply, that I would sacrifice for. And I would like to say that I would sacrifice a lot for most people. And I think that's something that the Lord has grown in me. Maybe I wouldn't be willing to sacrifice my life for just anybody, but I've become more and more willing to sacrifice other things, to sacrifice comfort, money, time, to show that I value these people, because their value comes from what Jesus has said about them. And Jesus has said that they're worth dying for. That's what he did. He came and he died for each individual person. And that's the measure of each person's value, that you are worth sacrificing for. Now, I want to pause for a minute because I've been talking a lot about other people and how we perceive other people and how we interact with someone else's value. But I understand that sometimes not everybody is aware of their own value. And so if you are in this room and you don't feel particularly valuable, if you don't know what you are worth, let me just tell you that each of these statements applies to you. What you think of yourself is a reflection of how you perceive your value. And your usefulness is not the same as your value. The things that you do are not a reflection of your value. The things that you don't do are not a reflection of your value. Your usefulness is not the same. And acknowledging your own value means changing your perception of yourself. It means believing that you are a person who can do better, who can do more, who can be more. And most importantly, your value is not determined by what you've done, but by what Jesus says about you. At the end of this, and we'll talk a little bit more about Philemon next week, but at the heart of this and at the end of this, Paul has an action step for Philemon. It's not just to see Onisimus as Paul sees him. That's part of it, certainly. But there's a more tangible action step that is found in verses 15 and 16 here. Perhaps this is the reason he was separated from you for a while, so that you might have him back forever. No longer as a slave, but more than a slave, a beloved brother. The action step here is to receive him back into his house in a position that reflects his value. To do something that reflects Onesimus' value, that he is no longer the runaway slave, but he is included in the family. He is a brother, and a beloved one at that. So, knowing a person's value is really important. Believing that they have value is really important. But belief in a person's value is meaningless if you don't express it. It's meaningless without the expression of it. If you say, yeah, I believe that you're valuable, I believe that you have worth, but you don't treat people like they do, if you don't treat yourself like you have value, then that belief doesn't mean anything. It doesn't carry any weight. So, my action step for you guys is to think of somebody in your life. Maybe it's somebody you don't particularly value. Maybe it's somebody you do value who may not know that you value them. Maybe it's even yourself. And do something that expresses the true value of that person. Find some way to show that person that they are cared for and that they are loved and that they are valuable. Because if we are a people who believe that value comes from Jesus and we don't express that, then what's the point? So my challenge to you is find a way to express value for somebody in your life. So I'm going to pray over us. Okay. Lord, we thank you so much that you are a God who has said that we are worth something, that we are worth dying for, that we are worth sacrificing for. Thank you for the value that you instill in each one of us, Lord. I pray that as we go throughout this week, that you show us how to see people with your eyes, how to see people the way that you see them. Let us understand the true value of the people that we interact with, and out of an overflow of that, God, let us be willing to sacrifice for them. Let us be willing to serve them and to love them as you would love them, God. Thank you for the things that you are going to do in our relationships and in our hearts this week, Lord. And it's in your name that we pray. Amen. Let's go into this week, and may we be people who see the Lord who see each other as the Lord sees us. May we be people with God's vision. Thanks, guys.